Hey, welcome back to Pianist Academy and the Soundboard. I'm Charles Szczepanek, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming pianist, composer, music director, educator, and the creator and host of the All Keyed Up podcast, Ben Kapilow. Ben's musical background is quite varied, from studying jazz piano with instructors from the Juilliard School when he was just 17, to composing music for children's performance, to actively teaching piano, songwriting, and vocal lessons, to even being a director of musical theater. He holds a master's in composition from the esteemed Peabody Conservatory, and he's also the host of one of the top piano podcasts in the world. He's going to be presenting at the Creative Teaching Conference in Cincinnati this month about teaching lyric writing in the context of piano lessons. I am so excited for today's conversation. So Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Charles, for having me. Excited to be here.
Awesome. You know, I love hearing stories about how musicians get started in their lives, and I think those stories can serve two purposes. First, highlighting just how different everyone's story is, and secondly, inspiring all of us wherever we are in our current musical journey. So, Ben, could you fill us in a little on your backstory? Why did you start studying music, and how old were you, and what was the inspiration behind that?
Sure. I started when I was in about third grade. I took piano lessons for a year or two, but I didn't really like them. I was never very serious about it, and then eventually I quit. The lessons were very cookie cutter and straight out of a method book and nothing particularly inspiring. But then in about eighth grade, I tried again with a much more, I would say, experimental teacher who had a big focus on composition and had me do jazz and modern classical, had me write essays about the music I like, having a really creative teacher like that, her name was Kris Davis, that got me much more interested in music. And that's when I would really say that my passion for music developed, was when I started taking lessons with Kris Davis. And in a way, that got me re-interested in all of the elements of music that previously were boring. So then once I had a teacher who was really interested in composition and having me write my own pieces, then I was interested in scales because I could apply them to my own pieces. And there were all of these things that in third grade were very boring, but then in eighth grade with this new teacher became much more interesting.
Sure. That's a great story. Do you feel like in that span of time, did you have friends like in that span of time that friends that kept taking lessons? Like, did you know other people that were with your first teacher? Mm-hmm. And then did you like keep in touch with them, or did you not really?
No, I did.
I didn't when I was younger. I knew a couple people, but like we never.
Yeah, so you never did any kind of ensemble or chamber music or play in a band or something.
Not when I was that young.
No. I did play in, I guess, the school band. I played trumpet, and then in middle school, I took drum lessons and played in, I guess, one summer camp. I was in a jazz band. But no, unlike some people for whom taking music lessons is a social activity and they have maybe group lessons, or they're involved in a music school that has all sorts of things beyond just the private lessons, and that's how they get a community. That was never my experience, although I do suggest to many other piano teachers that being able to build a community in some sense with your students is a great way to improve studio retention. And I talked about that on several interviews on All Keyed Up, but that was not my experience. And I guess it sounds like it wasn't yours either.
No, it was not mine either. So would you say, does what caused you the inspiration back in eighth grade? Is that still kind of the impetus today, like composition, or has it changed?
No, I would say that has been completely the model for everything I do, not just in my own interest in composition, but the way that I teach, the type of interviews I do on my podcast. I am very inspired by the approach that my eighth grade teacher took.
Cool.
And I think when I teach students today, there's so much stuff that she does that I do in my own way, and I'm very interested in piano lessons that go outside of the box and that don't do like what my third grade teacher did. Right.
Could you give us an example, like one example that comes to mind about something that is outside of the box? I mean, I think we both know like what traditional classical piano lessons look like, but for someone that might not be aware, or someone that's self-taught, let's say, and they haven't had lessons yet, what is outside of the box of a typical, and what's something that you would do that you're like really excited to show a student that you didn't get until you were older?
That's such a good question. And I would say they should listen to my podcast because I have so many interviews about different activities, but I can definitely give some examples. One would be writing your own songs, whether they have lyrics or whether it's composition, and not just doing it as its own block at the beginning of the lesson. I know it's pretty common, actually, and I would say almost cookie cutter for our teachers to have the first 5 minutes or so be about maybe improvising, and they'll say improvise on the black notes, but incorporating composition and improvisation with everything else. So for instance, if you're playing a piece of music in D major that has a left-hand Alberti bass, improvising with a left-hand Alberti bass, but not doing the right hand of the piece, having the right hand improvise above the Alberti bass that was written. That would be an example of something I would say is outside of the box.
Yeah.
Or constantly, every time you learn a new concept, bringing it back to improvisations. That would be definitely one example of something that I would say is experimental, or at least not purely cookie cutter. Sure. Another one would be learning pop songs by ear from the Spotify or something. So taking pieces that kids like and using that as a springboard for an ear training exercise and coming up with improvisations together. There's a great resource out there. Meredith Winters has a book of chord patterns. There's also someone who appeared on my podcast his name escapes me right at this second, but I will remember it, I think, in the next minute or so. But he wrote a book called 100 Left-Hand Piano Patterns. And in that book, it's all different patterns you can do with chords. So taking a song that someone is interested in from the radio and having the left hand do chord patterns, whether they make them up themselves or use them from this left-hand piano pattern book or from a Meredith Winters book or something similar, and using that left hand or both hand chord pattern while either playing the melody in the right hand or singing it while playing chord patterns. That would be something I think is experimental. Yeah. One more, and then I promise I'm done. Sure. Because I'm passionate about this subject. Another one would be movement activities. There's books that incorporate movement activities within it. So Music Moves for Piano is an example of that. But teachers can incorporate movement activities themselves. So maybe the teacher plays something and then the student does some kind of movement that distinguishes the downbeat from the other beats. So if the piece is in 3/4, maybe the student could go like bend, clap, clap, bend, clap, clap, while the teacher is playing it. Something where they can feel the music in their whole body as opposed to just fingers only, where the playing can sound maybe correct in the sense that the rhythms will be held for the right duration, but they won't have a rhythmic feel. I think movement activities can bring a lot to that.
Yeah, that we can internalize. From doing all that extra stuff. And then, and then it really shows when we actually play something.
You could teach conducting. That's a great way to incorporate movement activities into lessons. And there's lots of fun activities you can do with that. I have one episode on All Keyed Up with Benjamin Steinhardt that's all about movement activities. So there, I gave you three. Songwriting,
that's beautiful.
Improvisation.
That's awesome. And gosh, in my own lessons, I don't think I ever had a lesson with anybody about anything like that.
Oh, really? What were your lessons like growing up?
Very standard, like typical method book lessons. Up
and
until
that was,
I was like,
your training like from childhood
that was
to
until
now?
I was like 12-ish, 12, 13. And then I got a fantastic, phenomenal classical teacher. And so obviously it was not method book any longer. It was, very advanced repertoire, but it was still only repertoire and technique.
What made that teacher so helpful to you compared to the other teachers?
He completely rebuilt my technique. So he enabled me to basically take college auditions and compete and be a teacher today. At least, with good technique and exploring musicality and things. But the entire, I have a huge interest in songwriting and pop music and other more contemporary is a mixed word when you're talking with a classical musician. But you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Not contemporary classical music, but contemporary mainstream.
Yeah.
Let's say.
I completely understand what you mean.
Yeah. And I've always had that, but so my entire experience, like doing contemporary music, was all on my own. Like
you
my
never
parents,
worked on it with a teacher, even to this day?
That component was completely self-taught.
Oh, okay.
So like I won't tell the whole story, but my mother, she always gets upset when I mention this, but she loves the Beatles, big Beatles fan.
Okay.
And she used to buy all the sheet music to the Beatles books and put them on the piano after I'd finished practicing and say, "Can you play me a song that I know?" and so I'd play stuff, and then she would eventually tell me like, "Well, that doesn't really sound like the song. Can you make it sound more like the song?" So I taught myself like how to read the chord changes.
Oh, cool.
How to incorporate that into the piano part, how to read 3 lines, the piano part and the vocal line at the same time, which like, that's another thing that super helped me out when I was a little older. And, I was directing and conducting and I needed to like reduce a score, a sight reading. But yeah, I never had a formal lesson about any of that. It's all been complete. And today, I really understand the value in all that, and I try to teach that stuff as well.
Yeah, I think it's very common to have people do what you're describing, where during their lessons, they work on their repertoire and their method books, but then they go home and do something different than what they do in the lessons. So maybe it means improvising, or in your case, it means playing pieces by the Beatles, or in other cases, it means playing something more contemporary. And to me, this is just my opinion, I think it's almost a little sad that what the student actually wants to do with the piano is distinct from what they're doing in the lessons. And so I do use pop music all the time in my studio, and I always am interested in what type of music the students listen to. But there's obviously a huge advantage. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I actually only have one student right now that does not want to play pop music, and the rest of them fully incorporated. Like there's some classical, some pop, some ear training, it's all over the map. So that's
great.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I will say I do want to jump off that point you just made. I'm not saying every student should be doing this. I think you want to teach to the student. So you say you have one student who doesn't want to do pop. I have much more than that. I have some who really can't stand it. And I have several students where what they want is more of a cookie cutter approach. And so you try to teach to the student. So I'm all about adjusting as much as you need.
So maybe you've kind of already answered this in the last couple minutes, but what do you think distinguishes a great teacher from a good teacher?
Yeah, that's such a thought-provoking question, and there's so many different avenues we can go with this, and I'm interested in hearing your perspective on this too. But out of all the different things I could say, I'll highlight one thing that I think is, to me, a key difference between good teaching and great teaching. And I just alluded to it a little bit with the last thing I said about teaching to the student. I would say for me, a good teacher is someone who is knowledgeable about the main teaching techniques out there. They take the student through a curriculum that makes sense. They can move from lesson to lesson in a way that's systematic and not random. They can explain ideas clearly. I would say that would be, to me, what a good teacher is, where you sign the student up with the teacher and you get what you paid for, and good job.
Yes,
a great teacher, I would say, is everything I just said, but the additional element of being able to be completely locked in with what the student is doing at every second, and fine-tuning and adjusting everything with respect to what the student is giving you, and being able to pick up on what the student knows, what the student needs to work on, what the student is interested in, what the student's personality is like, and always infinitely making both small scale adjustments in terms of the way you formulate the sentences you say to the student, but also big picture adjustments to the curriculum to make sure you're customizing it to what the student is giving you as much as possible. And I think this is true in all aspects of teaching, not just music teaching. So I take exercise classes, and for whatever reason in my apartment complex, no one goes to the exercise classes except me. So it becomes private lessons. And there's one teacher I would have who is not listening to this podcast and to this YouTube clip, so I'm sure I'm not offending anyone, but who I would say is a good teacher, in that he knows about all the muscles. muscles. He knows what exercises work. When we do the classes, he goes through each muscle, and we do the ab exercises, we do the leg exercise. It works. It's definitely what you're expecting from an exercise class. He answers my questions. It's not too hard. So that to me is good teaching. But then there's another teacher who is all of that, but is so relentless about feedback and will not let me get away with anything, and will give me feedback down to like, you have to bend this one joint this way, and no, you're doing this. I noticed last week that you also had an issue with having your wrists not be perfectly parallel with your like that type of thing. And I feel like that to me is what great teaching is not only is she knowledgeable about what is expected in an exercise class, but she notices everything I do and gives constant, subtle feedback and makes the lesson all about me. And you can tell like 100% of her brain is locked in on what I'm doing in the class. So to me, that would be the difference between good teaching and great teaching. It's being totally present and totally aware and thoughtful about what the student is doing at each moment.
I completely agree. And you mentioned it right at the beginning too, but usually what I would say is being keenly aware of what the students' goals are and not teaching. I mean, we need to explore things that are around, to have a well-rounded music education, but always being aware of like helping the student reach further and further toward their goals and not towards something that, isn't in their mind or isn't something that they want to do. And that kind of goes back to the very first thing we talked about today with lessons, not working out at the beginning for you and then being super inspiring later on because the teaching wasn't, and you maybe didn't even know what your goals were. When you were very young. And I mean, most of us probably don't, but
I think I'm sorry to interrupt. I think it's a collaboration of finding goals together. I think sometimes what a student thinks is their goal is not actually their goal, or there's a possible goal that the student didn't even know was a possible goal. And once they start working on it, then it becomes their goal. But then there's also goals that the student has for themselves. And so I think it's important to collaborate with the student on goals, as opposed to being a teacher who thinks, every single student, my goal is to get them to play in competitions. It's to get them to do this and that and that. I think you have to teach to the student. So I completely agree with what you're saying.
Absolutely. Awesome. If you're enjoying today's interview, please give the video a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to the channel. And if you really like the video, please share it on social media. Maybe you have friends or fellow piano teachers that you might know. Please consider sharing it on social media and ding that notification bell so you don't miss out on future content. All right, back to the interview. So far, this channel, Pianist Academy, has been about classical piano and classical technique, and I have plans to expand that because I've had a handful of songwriting students, and we've already talked a little bit about pop music and songwriting and stuff. And I love that component of music just as much as I love the great classical repertoire. But I feel like it's an aspect of teaching and exploring that there's just not a ton of resources or guides out there for students or for teachers. We've talked about a couple earlier today, but like when you teach songwriting, let's say, do you have a plan that you go through, like a basic foundational plan? Like, is it focused on theory, or do we focus on what like the student is feeling and let them experiment? How do you structure a songwriting lesson? Because that's so different than like a typical classical or even jazz lesson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to be clear, when we're talking about songwriting, I am assuming you're asking about in a more pop idiom. Yeah. Because sometimes...
Not composition.
Yeah. Because I definitely have students who do that too. And I don't know if you teach classical composition. And that's its own sphere. But if we're talking about songwriting, meaning there's lyrics, there's going to be singing, that the first thing I would say to that is I definitely don't do that with everyone. That is definitely acquired taste because some students don't like singing. Some students get self-conscious singing. Some students are not interested in this. So I pick and choose who I'm going to do this with. But going back to my other question about sometimes what you think are your goals are not your goals, or sometimes there's a possible goal that you don't even know is possible. I think there's some students who may not think they're interested in songwriting, but once they give it a shot, they like it. So sometimes I gently nudge towards it, but I definitely don't teach this with everyone. But as far as your question, so how to teach songwriting, first off, not to just give a shameless plug, but I have an episode on my podcast on All Keyed Up on exactly this topic. It's called How to Teach Songwriting, and it's with Christopher Oyle. So that's one where I really get into the nuts and bolts, although that's more about his approach than my approach. But my approach is basically, I always do lyrics first. The reason, I mean, I could get into the reasons for that. I don't want to take up this whole interview just getting into that.
No, this is great.
Basically,
I love it.
My reasoning for that is if you do music first, think about a younger student who's not very advanced. If you do music first, let's say I say to a student, okay, the melody we came up with is da 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 da. Come up with lyrics that fit that. That's kind of complicated. Like to come up with lyrics that fit a melody. But if I say the word is I like summer, you sing something that goes along with those lyrics. That is a much easier task. I mean, you can, I like summer, I like summer, I like summer. That's much easier than if I give them ba-ba-doo-doo-doo, and then they think, I will go to school. Like, that's a little hard for a younger student. So at least for the younger students or the more beginners, I do lyrics first. So I usually have them pick a topic, and if they have trouble, I might suggest topics. If it's younger students, usually I pick something fairly innocuous like the weather or what their favorite hobby is, or pick a season. But anyway, once we pick a topic, then I basically have them word vomit about that topic. So I'm at my computer and I just let them ramble about the topic as much as they want. So let's say the topic was summer. Maybe they will say, okay, I go to the beach, it's very hot, I wear sunscreen, it's my favorite season. And eventually, once you start prodding and guiding the conversation along, you'll usually, and I try to steer it this way, notice that some of what they say about the topic is more detail focused, and some of what they say about the topic is more big picture. So if it's summer, there might be details like I go to the beach, but then there'll be more big picture ideas like it's my favorite season, it's so fun. You know, I love summer or something. And so I talk to them about the verse and the chorus. And I'll say, usually the verse is where you have more details and the chorus is where you have more big picture ideas. And there's so many songs you could use to illustrate this. Shake It Off by Taylor Swift, or you mentioned the Beatles. Eleanor Rigby is the perfect example of this because we go through specific lonely people in the verses, but then the chorus is, look at all the lonely people. So after they've given this brainstorm of different ideas, we write down what ideas lend themselves more to the verses and what ideas lend themselves more to the choruses. And then we go from there and we write lines. So I tell them we should write something that ends in a word that's easy to rhyme with and that isn't too long. So if it's about summer, maybe the first line will be, I don't know, I go to the pool. And then I'll write a list of words that rhyme with pool. And then usually the student can do this. So cool, fool, drool, rule. And so maybe we'll say, okay, I like to go to the pool. Summer is very cool. I don't know. Something like that. And so then that's how we work on the verse. And then we do the same thing in the chorus. The only difference is that in the chorus, I teach them that there needs to be a hook. So if it's the summer, I say, let's see if we can think of a short phrase that can be the title of the song, which we repeat over and over again about the summer. So let's say in this example, again, I'm just making this up off the top of my head. Let's say, I'm making this so simple. Summer is the best. Okay. So in the chorus, maybe we'll go, summer is the best, summer is the best, summer is the best, better than all the rest. I mean, okay, that's quite banal. I would probably prod the student to be a little more creative than that, but that would be an example.
Sure. But I mean, there's stuff on the radio that's not that much more complicated than that.
So that's how we do the chorus. And then by that point, we should have the lyrics, and then we work on the music. I could talk about that too. I don't want to take up this whole interview.
Just a little slight tangent from where you are. Do you find that as you're doing the lyrics that the rhythm gets incorporated at the same time? Because as you're kind of going through the text, obviously like syllables and sentences, they have certain natural rhythms to them. And do you find that the students pick up on that?
That is a fantastic question. I think that they sometimes do, sometimes don't, but I try to prod in that direction, especially when we're doing rhymes. So going back to my example, let's say they say, I go to the pool, or actually that was bad because I emphasized the wrong syllable. I go to the pool. Then I'll say to the student, okay, we need ba-da-da-da rhymes with pool. And so by that point, when I said that, I've kind of already started incorporating a rhythm. So some do more than others. But yes, I do teach that we want to have something that's rhythmic. Going back to what I said earlier, that's why I say we want something shorter that's easier to rhyme with, because usually it's easier to find a rhythm that works with a line like summer is the best than it is for a line like, I don't know, in the summer I do a lot of different things that are fun. Yeah. It's a lot harder to come up with a rhythm for something like that. So I think if you keep the lines compact and not too long, then it's easier to come up with a rhythm.
Awesome. Yeah. But I mean, I would love to hear a little bit about where you take the music from there.
Yeah. And I want to hear what you do too, because this is something that I'm constantly calling into question in my own teaching. And this is not something that I picked up from anyone else as far as I'm aware. I'm sure there are other teachers who do this, but I've just sort of developed this over the years. Musically, I would say the younger they are, the more I frame it as choices. And the older they are, the more I structure it more as music theory and let them basically figure it out. So with the absolute most beginner, I do a lot of, here are some options. What do you like the best? So I'm just going to keep going back to the summer example. So let's say we're writing a song about summer. I'll start out and I'll say, well, what do you think the dynamic should be? Should it be piano, forte? I assume if it's summer, they would say forte. Okay, should the tempo be faster, moderate, slow? If it's summer, okay, probably something more upbeat. Okay, let's see if we could come up with a chord pattern. And if they're very beginner, I might just give them choices. Or we could use GarageBand and use GarageBand loops, and that would give them choices. And then I would let them pick. And so most of that aspect would be I give them the choices. But if they're older, I think they can do some of that themselves. So maybe they could come up with at least a chord progression maybe, and then I'll come up with possible chord patterns. Or if they're even older than that, maybe they can do both. So again, you have to teach it to the student. So there's a full spectrum we can draw from everything is I give them choices to they come up with everything. And that would be a high school student where really they do it all. And whatever guiding I do along the way, I'm not actually writing any of the notes for them. I would say, okay, we need chords and we need a melody, and they would really do it all. So you have to find with the student where they fit on the spectrum. But I would say there's, again, a full spectrum we can draw from.
Absolutely.
Nothing but choices. And for that, I do think GarageBand is great if you're going to have a student like that who's really a pure beginner, because no matter what you pick, it's going to sound good.
That's helpful. Yeah. And then they don't learn that there are no wrong choices. Do you listen at all to Jacob Collier?
Of course. Yeah.
Right. That's a dumb question.
No, it's not.
But one of the things I heard him say this a couple years ago. One of the things that really stuck out was when he was growing up. I'm from a super musical family, and but his family and his teachers, they all told him there are no wrong choices in music. And I think that's so valuable. And like what it just reminded me what you're talking about in GarageBand, like having everything where it sounds good and it's positive, and we're just reinforcing like this is fun. It can sound great, and where we don't make the student like nervous or second guess themselves.
I think what you're describing is exactly the issue most students have with not just songwriting, but even improvisation, is they think they have to make the perfect choice and it's going to sound bad. And so I think there's different solutions to that. I think one of them is, I guess if we really want to go extreme, is what you're describing with Jacob Collier. We're saying there's no wrong choices. You can make any note work. I forget who it is. There's someone else who said you can make any note work with any note.
Any chord.
Actually, you know what? Yeah. Now that I'm thinking about this, I think Jacob Collier might have had a video about that. There's one where he teaches music to all the different
levels.
levels. And then I think one of
yeah.
the ones is where he goes through within the scale any possible two notes and how you could harmonize anything.
Yes.
So on the one level, you could say to the student, anything works. But I think on a more basic level, you could do things like GarageBand, or you set up a lot of structures, even if it's just going to be piano only, where it's going to sound good no matter what. And that could work whether it's songwriting or even in improvisation, setting up the system so it's going to sound good no matter what. One person who I think is really great at that is Johnny May. He's another YouTuber, if you know him. And he
definitely
has a lot of different improv exercises on his YouTube channel. And he's great at coming up with these different improv exercises where he sets some of the rules for the improv where it's going to sound good no matter what you do. And so I think that helps get over the self-consciousness that a lot of students feel. So I think with the younger students, you have to make a lot of the decisions for them. But I think as they get older, they start to learn what sounds good, and you can take off the reins.
Yeah. And I mean, I would agree.
So what do you
completely.
do? Let's hear your
I would agree
method.
completely with all of that. And I guess the only thing that I would add, and you might even do this as well, we just didn't talk about it yet, is at a certain point, somewhere in the middle of the road, before high school, before they're really advanced, but somewhere in the middle, I would incorporate like ear training and listening to other pop music that they like, and coming back in and saying, okay, well, we're working on our song, but while we're working on a new composition or a new song ourselves, let's listen to 2 or 3 other songs, come back in, could you find the chords by ear? Mm-hmm. Could you find the root of the chord by ear? Can you find the triad by ear? And then, like, can we break that down, and can you find rhythmic patterns? So just kind of trying to identify one thing at a time. Obviously, that is not for the beginner.
Sure.
But it's definitely, I think, something that needs to be incorporated before a student gets too far into their journey, because there's so much they can learn from. I mean, it's the same thing as studying classical composition too. You study the masters, and what they do. You score study, you listen, and I mean, so we can do the same thing with pop music, and say like, okay, here are the chords. Of course, I mean, you're going to find the most common 4 chords that are, in 90% of pop songs.
That's right.
But then we can go from there and say, well, let's listen to how Taylor Swift divides the piano part and what she plays in the left hand versus the right hand, or listen to how when Adele writes with her co-writer, like how he plays the piano part, and it's totally different. They might be the same chords, but they're very distinct sounds. Or if we're listening to like guitar-driven music, what are the strumming patterns, and can we imitate that on the piano if we're not playing guitar, but if we're at the piano, so that would be like the other thing that I would add to the discussion that we've already had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would go further, and I would say that ear training stuff that you're describing, where they figure out the chords themselves or they adapt the guitar pattern to the piano, they could then use that in their own pieces.
Exactly.
I often, especially if it's a student who doesn't have much experience songwriting, I think it's completely fine to literally use the chord progression from a different song that they like, especially since, as you said, a lot of these songs use the same chords anyway.
Right.
But I think it's a great exercise to use a piece that you already like and take some element of that and use that to get the ball rolling when you're songwriting. I think that's also true when I'm teaching composition. So if I have a student who's composing something for the first time, we can take something from the pieces in their repertoire or their method book and use that to get started for composition.
Totally. And I mean, this is so exciting for me because there's also, like, you can take those examples, if we go back to the pop music one, and then you can draw parallels between what they've learned by ear to the music they might buy on music notes. And then you can say, okay, well, here's the published version, and look at everything that it doesn't have that you came up with. Like,
your version is better.
You're already arranging your own stuff right off the bat. And that's super exciting, I think.
And that's going back to earlier in the interview, we're talking about things that students do by themselves that are unfortunately often not what they do in lessons. I think trying to adapt things they hear on, I guess I'm dated to say the radio, on Spotify or whatever, to the piano is something so many students do privately, not from their lessons. But that's such a valuable thing that you're describing, where you listen to a song and you try to figure out how to make the piano work like that. I was listening to an interview with Alex Lacamoire, who's the music director for Hamilton, and he was saying one of the big things he looks for in a pianist is how they can make the piano sound like drums. And so it has to do with playing rhythmically. It has to, I mean, there's all sorts of things we could get into, but I think for a lot of students, having them think out loud about how can we take this pop song that has all these different instruments, drums, guitar, maybe electronic sound effects, and how can we adapt all of that to just a piano is a great way to get them creatively thinking about all the possibilities of the instrument.
Totally. And just and the extent of the ear training that goes into listening to all of that stuff and listening like to all the layers that are present.
Yeah.
I know, especially in the classical world, pop music tends to have kind of a negative connotation. Or it has that kind of vibe about it, but and it's true. Okay, it's usually a little more simple. The melodies are more simple and the harmonies are more simple, yes, but if you listen to all of the layers in the production and you can teach someone to start to listen to all the layers, I mean, there are probably dozens, if not more, dozens of things going on simultaneously that are all related. And just, this ear training necessary to pick all of those out.
Yeah.
I mean, that's incredible. And I think that's so valuable.
I want to give a shout out to one person who I think is really helpful if you want to work with your students on this. I don't mean you specifically, you, but your listeners.
Everybody,
Nicola Canton has an organization called Vibrant Music Teaching, and one resource she offers is called Ear Training Elevator, and it's a great resource to do exactly what you're talking about, because she takes a pop-sounding song, and first you have the student listen to the whole thing, but then she divides it up into each instrument and turns it into an ear training exercise where she has a recording of just this instrument, and there's guided questions, like she really takes you through the steps. And so it's a great way of really working with a student on being able to hear something with a bunch of instruments and adapting it by ear. And I think doing it that way, where she really takes you through each step and you have recordings of each instrument by itself, in addition to the recording of everything, is in some cases a lot less intimidating than just playing them the whole song and saying, okay, let's arrange it. So that's one great resource that I use a lot in my studio.
Absolutely. I'm going to write that one down.
Vibrant Music Teaching, Ear Training Elevator.
Awesome. So let's move on. We've already been talking a little bit about the podcast, but I really, really want to get into that. Did it start? I think I looked online, and did it start in January of 21?
February.
February. Okay.
Although I was doing prep work in January of 2021.
Okay. Okay. So what was the impetus behind starting that? I mean, that's not like a very common thing that you hear a musician or a teacher or a performer. It's not, something that you usually hear about.
Yeah, it was founded because of the pandemic. So my full-time job before the pandemic and now, but not, well, I guess we're still sort of in the pandemic. I mean, like during like the lockdown part of the pandemic.
Yes.
I was a music director for a theater called the Media Theater, and that was my full-time job. And piano teaching was always on the side. It was a supplemental form of income that I did whenever I had some downtime at the theater. But then when the lockdowns happened, my theater had to stop producing shows, and so suddenly all I had was teaching, and specifically online lessons. And what I realized when I was doing nothing but teaching, as opposed to before when it was on the side, is that there's so much I didn't know about teaching, and I had never really done any kind of serious work on trying to be better at teaching, and I had honestly kind of neglected it. And so I thought about ways that I could make a project out of becoming a better piano teacher. And the first thing that came to mind is what I guess most people would probably do, which is just read books about piano pedagogy or something, which is fine. And I did do that. And I've talked about some of the books that I like on my podcast. But I thought more fun would be talking to the experts and learning from them. And then that's how the podcast was formed, is the idea of someone who is just a regular old piano teacher, not a specialist. So I don't really, credential-wise, have any credential, or at least maybe now I've become a little bit more involved in the industry. But when I started, I definitely had no credentials besides just being a piano teacher. And so I wanted to interview these experts and take anyone else who was interested along for the ride. And so that's how the podcast was formed, was talking to some of the experts in piano teaching about all sorts of different topics. And my thinking was that I'm the same as most of my listeners. So there must be a lot of other listeners out there who, like me, are just a regular old, not specialist piano teacher who may be like me, and also, I think like you, do a lot of stuff besides piano teaching and have a wide range of interests and haven't really dug down into the minutia of piano pedagogy.
Right.
And so my thinking was I would ask the same types of questions that my listeners would have, was the goal. And so that's how All Keyed Up was formed.
Awesome. That's great. That's great. So many really cool things came out of the pandemic.
Yeah.
I think.
When did you start your YouTube channel again?
I just started it this past April. Oh, actually.
Congratulations.
So
okay.
Thanks.
What was your inspiration?
Oh gosh. I think I saw a handful of teachers online that were really good. Mm-hmm. And I saw a lot of teaching online that was really not good. And I thought, oh my goodness. I thought, I can really be of help in this area. And I can just teach a lot of different things. And so I'm hopeful that over the course of the channel growing and things, that we can get into a wide variety of topics and cover a whole lot of stuff. But yeah, that was really the idea, was like, there are a couple people that are really good and they've done great work. And I think I have something I can add to the community. So
when you say that you had online teaching that you found that you thought wasn't very good, are you talking about sort of tutorial piano videos on YouTube? Is that what you mean? Or some things on YouTube, some things on Facebook, just like all over the place. Okay.
And
I definitely hear you. I mean, I've had so many instances in my studio where students come to me with things that they learned from YouTube or social media that are so not helpful. And so sometimes,
and I think it's totally possible to get the foundation of an education from YouTube and from online video and online courses and things like that. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily think it's a replacement for a teacher, an in-person teacher that you meet with one-on-one, especially if you really want to take music to a high level. And even for just enjoyment, like there's something that you cannot replace about having that one-on-one interaction. But I do think that if it's done the right way, teaching online and through video can really be valuable to people.
Yeah. I don't mean to turn everything into a plug, but I have one episode with Courtney Crappel, who's the director of music at, I believe, the University of Houston. And it's about a bunch of topics, but one topic that we talked about a lot was how piano teachers can incorporate the existent YouTube videos out there in a way that's symbiotic. So where we can use those videos to our credit, and we can use them maybe to teach some of the things that we're tired of teaching, or we can use it as a supplement to our teaching, but how to find the perfect marriage between a live teacher and the YouTube videos out there.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, now that really the pandemic has made... One, it's made like video teaching, I think, more accepted than it was prior. And two, there's just, in the modern internet world, there are so many people that are interested in so many things. And I mean, a lot of times, especially like adults that want to take music lessons, I can totally see them not necessarily wanting to go to a studio that's full of children taking music lessons. Just because of how that would feel, or an adult taking music lessons and then playing a recital that is 95%, kids that are 10 or 12 years old. And there's a massive population of both working and retired adults that just want to explore music more. And I think they have trouble finding a place where they're comfortable doing that.
Right.
So that's one of the things I think that online teaching can really fill that gap, where they're not necessarily going to go and have an in-person teacher, at least not maybe until they feel more comfortable. So, yeah, that was kind of, those are my reasons
I think
behind
that
it.
In some ways is the future. I was doing one interview with Josh Wright. I don't know if that's a name you know. He's in the YouTube.
Yeah, I watch his channel, yeah.
Yeah, so I was doing an interview with him, and he said he thinks the future of piano teaching is online videos and lessons. Not to say that means there won't be any live teachers anymore or anything, but that's going to be part of everyone's piano experience. Will at least supplementally be online lessons. And I see where he's coming from, and they're becoming more and more popular.
Yeah, totally. So when you interview people on your podcast, do you have favorite bits? I mean, they're all of the interviews they're very different topics, and you're interviewing people that are all over, experiences in the business, from teaching and running studios to experts in certain advanced, techniques to improv, like we talked about. It's a really wide range of stuff, and I find that really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you do the same with your YouTube video, right?
A little bit. Yeah. I'm trying to.
Yeah, really. Well, you're newer, but I mean, I'm sure that seems to be that path that you're headed down.
Sure.
I mean, I embrace the variety, like you say. I mean, not to dodge the question, but I like it all. I like when I look back at the episodes and I see how different they were. Even though you would think a topic like piano teaching is like the definition of niche, I love that. On the one hand, I have some episodes like with Marvin Blickenstaff, who is very esteemed, not traditional, but a very esteemed piano teacher, and we talk about the nuts and bolts of piano pedagogy down to teaching thumb crossing. I mean, we are so specific about the foundational elements of piano pedagogy. But then I have the interview like with Daryl Harper about the history of teaching improvisation and how it was affected by the Industrial Revolution, which I think is connected to piano teaching, but not nearly in the same way that the interview with Marvin Blickenstaff was. So I embrace the variety. But as far as my favorite types of interviews, if I had to really pick a favorite, I think it's the ones where it's the combination of, number one, they are suggesting something that is outside of the box and that most teachers are not already doing, and that teachers could do if they wanted. So it's not so abstract that it couldn't obviously find its way into a lesson. Those are the types of interviews.
Practical.
Yeah, practical, but also not traditionally done. So possible. Those are the types of interviews I like. So just to give some little examples, I did one episode with Ariel Weiss, who's an Alexander technique specialist who teaches at Curtis. And in part of the interview, she completely shot down the idea of telling students to relax in terms of techniques and to sit up straight. And she went through why she thinks those are bad things to say, and then she offered alternatives. I think those stuff are really rewarding because I could imagine a lot of my listeners would actually change their teaching because of that.
Yeah.
Those are the types of things that I think are the most rewarding. And I love when I hear from other teachers who've listened to the podcast and talked about how they've made changes because of the episode. I guess those are the ones that I like the most.
Cool.
Particularly if those changes nudge in the direction of the more experimental, out-of-the-box type of teaching that I described at the beginning of the interview. That's, I think, when I feel the most rewarded, is when I feel like I have episodes that take a specific topic, and before that, a teacher's thinking about it was here, and now the episode has opened it up to here. That's, I think, what's the most rewarding.
Yeah, awesome. So just one final question today. So we've talked a bit about now, I mean, between the podcast and YouTube channel and the world of online music education, would you have any words of wisdom for, let's say, like a student that's primarily self-taught and online? That, I mean, maybe they have a lesson with a teacher once in a while, maybe they don't. But do you have any words of wisdom or advice you could share with someone that's coming at music from that perspective?
Sure. I would say this is something that we certainly mentioned earlier in the interview, but that I really want to pin down and drive the point home is, in my opinion, the way that piano works best for most people is if it constantly goes back to improvisation all the time. And so I would say if you're in a situation where you're learning piano, whether it's through a teacher or online, I would say keep coming back to improvisation. And I don't mean just sit at the piano and make stuff up just off the top of your head, although that's valuable too. I would say keep coming back to improvisation when you learn new concepts. So if you learn what a dotted quarter note is, improvise with dotted quarter note rhythms. If you learn a new scale, improvise in that scale. If you're playing a piece, maybe take the left hand of that piece and improvise your own right hand, then take the right hand and improvise your own left hand, or maybe take that chord progression and improvise with that chord pattern, but keep going back to improvising. I think that's really the way that you learn piano, is not only playing things that other people wrote, but in really experiencing it from the inside out. I think that if you think of how we learn languages, I mean, how do you learn? Let's say I wanted to learn French. Would I mostly learn French by hearing something that someone else said in French and repeating it back? Or would I try to make up my own sentences in French? I would make up my own sentences. And so I think same thing with learning the language of music. I would say language is improvisation. And so I think that the more improvising, the better. And I have,
Absolutely.
Again, not to just plug every single thing in your question, but I have 2 episodes about this. One is with Johnny May and one is with Brenda Earl Stokes. And in both of them, we talked a lot about different ways that teachers can incorporate improvisation.
Yes. Brilliant. No, thank you, Ben. And no, I think everybody should really go and check out the podcast. So I do not mind. I'm actually going to leave a link to it in the description for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So Ben, it's been a pleasure having you on today.
No, this was so fun. And I'm definitely going to also link to your YouTube on my podcast to make sure everyone checks out your stuff as well. It was super fun.
Awesome. If you enjoyed hearing from Ben Kapilow today, you really need to check out the All Keyed Up podcast. It's available on all the major podcasting platforms, but if you aren't familiar with those, I'll leave a link to listen right on his website in the description below. Like we've talked about today, there are all sorts of episodes out there, from improv to advanced classical techniques to songwriting to stage fright and music business. It's really everything. So I'd highly recommend that you go and check out at least one episode, and I think you'll be hooked and want to check out more after that. Thanks for watching this episode of The Soundboard. Remember, practice smarter, not harder. And I'll see you next time you visit Pianist Academy.